What's up everybody, welcome to Never Stop Growing. I'm Jonathan Harrigan. In today's video, I'm gonna show you 8 techniques that every beginner should know when getting started with watercolor. So let's jump into it.
Okay, so make sure that you got your materials and that you got watercolor paper. It's super important that you actually have the right kind of paper for this, otherwise the techniques won't really work. After that, you want to make sure that you divided your paper into sections using tape, 4 on the top and 4 on the bottom, like I'm doing here. So watercolor can pretty much be divided into 2 basic sections, and that is wet on wet and wet on dry. For our first 4 techniques, we're going to talk about the wet on wet method, and then we're going to move on to the wet on dry method. So for the wet on wet method, what you have to do is you have to take your brush and load it with water and paint the surface of your paper like this before you put the actual paint on top of it. And that's why it's called wet on wet, is you're using wet paint on top of a wet surface. So our first technique in the wet on wet method is going to be a basic wash. And to do this, all you're going to do is load your brush up with paint, a nice flat brush, and lay the strokes across evenly. And what you're trying to focus on here is an even distribution of paint across the surface. You can load your brush back up with paint if you need to, but your end goal here is to get a nice even block of color. And washes are really great for if you're trying to get a nice solid color in your painting. So our next technique in the wet on wet method is going to be a basic color blend gradation. And the goal here is to blend one color seamlessly into another. So what we're going to do is we're going to take red and orange and we're going to blend them together. And so we're going to take red and we're going to load our brush with red, and we're just going to paint up the rectangle, not adding any more color to our brush. And as we continue to paint up the rectangle, we will lose pigment in the brush, and that will cause a natural gradation to form. So it should go from intense red to very diluted red, potentially even the white of the page if you're able to do that. And then you're going to do the same thing with orange from the opposite side. So starting from the top, you'll load your brush and you'll lay in the orange, starting from the top and going down, overlapping the red as you go. And you should be left with a nice even gradation from one color to another. Now, these blends are super great for working on skies, like sunsets, things like that. Those work really well when you're doing those kind of things in your paintings. Our next technique is called a bloom, and this is super simple. All you do is load your brush up with paint and put it on the wet surface, dabbing it into the surface. And as you do this, the paint should bleed out into the paper. These are great for adding texture or just a soft area of color if you need it in a specific location. Our last technique in the wet on wet is called lifting, and is probably arguably one of the more important techniques to know, because it essentially is the equivalent of having an eraser in watercolor. And it's pretty simple. You have to work while this is still fairly wet, or you want to work while it's still fairly wet. And all you do is load your brush with paint and paint a square, and then when you're ready to pull paint back up or lift it back up, all you do is get your brush dry and come back over the area that you wish to pull the paint up and just begin to pull it up. Now, practically, obviously, this works really well if you made a mistake and you want to pull paint back up, or if you're looking to try to make like clouds or something like that. This works really well for those techniques. So that leads us to our wet on dry techniques. And our first technique for wet on dry is going to be very similar to the first technique we did for wet on wet, and that is going to be another wash, but we're going to do a solid wash. So instead of getting the paper wet first, we're just going to load our brush up with lots of paint and we are going to paint on as solid and even a color as we can. And again, the goal here is to focus on an even distribution of paint and to get a really solid color. And this works pretty much the exact same way as your wash did for your wet on wet. You're looking to get a nice, solid, even tone of color over the surface of your painting. This works really well when you're laying something over other colors that have already dried and you don't want them to look transparent. So an example might be painting mountains over top of a sky that you've already painted in, and you don't want to see the sky through the mountains. This is a great technique because it gives you a nice rich color. So the next method in the wet on dry technique is called a transparent layer or transparent wash, and all you're trying to do is the same thing that you did with your solid wash, except for you're not going to load your brush with a ton of paint. You're going to load your brush and you're going to dilute the paint, and you're looking to get a wash that you can see through. And the goal and the benefit of this is that you can start to layer up colors. So if you're looking to layer things, or you're looking to add layers of value, maybe not color, but layers of value to your painting, this is a great one to use for that. Our next technique is called pulling, and to do this technique, what you want to do is you want to load your brush up with an intense amount of color and lay it in, and then dilute your brush with water and begin to pull that color away. And so what you'll be left with is a gradation from intense to less intense, and this allows you to control smaller areas of gradation. So if you're trying to get an intense area of color and have that kind of gradate out, this is a great one to use for that. Okay, so that brings me to our last technique, and that is going to be the splattering or spraying technique. And this one's really simple. You load your brush up, you take your finger and you begin to flick paint onto your canvas, and this allows you to get some pretty cool textures. And that brings us to the end of our video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Keep at it, never stop growing, and we'll see you guys in the next video.